I got to go back to Jim Webb and that book. What a badass, fascinating
Oh
book.
my God,
Born
it's
Fighting,
amazing.
how the Scots-Irish shaped America. So I did not realize to the degree, first of all, how badass the Scots-Irish are. And to the degree many of the things that kind of identify as American and part of the American spirit were defined by this relatively small group of
Yes.
people.
Yeah.
As he describes, the motto could be summarized as fight, sing, drink, and pray. So there's the principles of fierce individualism,
Mm-hmm.
the principles of a deep distrust of government, the elites, the authorities, bottom up governance, over 2,000 years of a military tradition. They made up 40% of the Revolutionary War Army and produced numerous military leaders, including Stonewall Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, George S. Patton, and a bunch of presidents.
Yeah.
Some of the more gangster presidents: Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
Just the whole cultural legacy of country music.
We owe them so much, and they really don't get their due, unfortunately. A lot of for the reasons that I just described around racialism is because post, mass immigration from Europe, the term white kind of became blanket applied to new Irish, to Italians, to Slovenians, and as you and I both know, if you travel those countries, people are pretty different, and it's not the different here in the United States. Scots-Irish were some of the original settlers here in America, and particularly in Appalachia, and their contribution to the fighting spirit and their own culture and like who we are as individualists, and some of the first people to ever settle the frontier, and that frontier mindset really does come from them. We owe them just as much as we do the Puritans, but they don't ever really get their due. And the reason I recommend that book is if you read that book and you understand then, how exactly could this group of white working class voters go from 2012 voting for a man named Barack Hussein Obama to Donald J. Trump. You really seem to, it makes perfect sense if you combine it with a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here about affirmative action, about distrust of the elites, about feeling as if institutions are not seeing through to you, and specifically also not valuing your contribution to American history, and in some cases actively looking down. I'm glad you pointed out not only their role in the Revolutionary War, but in the Civil War as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just how much of a contribution culturally, really, that we owe them for setting the groundwork that so many of us who came later could build upon and adopt some of their own ideas and their culture as our own. It's one of the things that makes America great.
Mark Twain.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of the culture, so much of the American spirit, the whole idea, the whole shape and form and type of populism that represents our democracy. So would you trace that fierce individualism that we think of back to them?
Definitely. It's a huge part of them, about who they were, about the screw you attitude. That book actually kind of had a renaissance back in 2016 when Hillbilly Elegy came out.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure you remember this, which it's kind of weird to think that it's now the vice president-elect of the United States. It's kind of wild, honestly, to think about. But J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, I think was really important for a lot of American elites who were like, how do these people support Trump? Where does this shit come from? That they're really, that if you really think back to that time, it was shocking to the elite character that any person in the world could ever vote for Donald Trump, and not just vote, he won the election. How does that happen? And that's Hillbilly Elegy guided people in an understanding of what that's like on a lived day-to-day basis. And JD, to his credit, talks about the Scots-Irish heritage, about Appalachia, and the legacy of what that culture looks like today, and how a lot of these people voted for Donald Trump. But we got to give credit to Jim Webb, who wrote the history of these people and taught me and you about their original fight against the oppressors in Scotland and in Ireland, and their militant spirit, and how they were able to bring that over here. And they got their due in Andrew Jackson and some of our other populist presidents who set us up on the road to Donald Trump to where we are today.
Dude, it got me pumped, excited to be an American.
Me too. I love that book.
It's crazy that JD, the same guy, because that's Hillbilly Elegy is what I kind of thought of him as.
Yeah, I'll tell you, for me, it's actually pretty surreal. I met J.D. Vance in like 2017. I didn't in like a bar. I didn't ever think he would be the vice president-elect of the United States. Just kind of wild. One of my friends went back and dug up the email that we originally sent him. Just like, hey, do you want to meet up? And he was like, sure. Okay, yeah. I was watching on television. The first time that it really hit me, I was like, whoa. It was like naming a history book. Is whenever he became the vice presidential nominee. I was watching him on TV, and the confetti was falling, and he was waving with his wife life. And I was like, wow, like that's it. You're in the history books now forever, especially now. So as the literal vice president elect of the U.S., but his own evolution is actually a fascinating story for us too, because I think a lot of the time I've spent right now is kind of a lot of what I'm giving right now are like 2016 kind of takes about like why Trump won that time. But we should spend a lot of time on how Donald Trump won this election and like how what happened, some of the failures of the Biden administration, some of the payback for the Great Awakening. But also, if you look at the evolution of J.D. Vance, this is a person who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. And not a lot of people pay attention to this, but if you read Hillbilly Elegy, JD was much more of a traditional conservative at that time. He was citing, report. I think the famous passage is about like payday loans and why they're good or something like that. I don't know his position today, but I would assume that he's probably changed that. But the point is that his ideological evolution from watching somebody who really was more of a traditional Republican with a deep empathy for the white working class, then eventually become a champion and a disciple of Donald Trump, and to believe that he himself was the vehicle for accomplishing and bettering the United States, but specifically for working class Americans, really of all stripes. And that story is really one of the rise of the modern left as it exists as a political project, as an ideology. It's also one of the Republican Party, which coalesced now with Donald Trump as a legitimate figure and as the single bulwark against cultural leftism and elitism that eventually was normalized to the point that majority of Americans decided to vote for him in 2024.